So Dr. Amy-Marie Gilpin is presenting now on supporting and conserving pollinators for sustainable crop production. So Amy is a school-based researcher and lecturer with the Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment at Western Sydney University. So really key about this, she's a pollination ecologist who's research to date has largely focused on identifying the pollinators in our ag landscapes and crops, both in temperate and tropical areas. So that's great. Thanks for your time, Anne-Marie, and I'll hand over to you to start your presentation.
No worries. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for attending. And I think this talk will actually complement exactly what Bianca's been talking about quite well. So yeah, I'm a plant pollinator ecologist, so I'm really interested in understanding the relationships between our pollinators and our plants, and that's obviously in a variety of different systems. But today I'll be mainly focusing in on those agricultural areas. So I guess the reason why I'm always concentrating on this kind of area of ecology is really with a conservation lens. So what I really want to be trying to do is to conserve pollinators that we have within these agricultural landscapes, or support them in terms of the floral resources that are available within those areas to try and secure pollination of our food crops. So I guess something that's always kind of lost is the fact that pollination is an inadvertent process. You know, these bees aren't going out there to purposefully do this process or fulfill the need for pollination. It's a mutualistic relationship, and the insects themselves are getting, rewards in terms of food, so nectar and pollen, and both are really crucial for health of the organism. And in return, that plant is hopefully getting fruit set or seed set as a result. Here are some pictures of some typical Australian agricultural scenes that I'm sure you guys are all aware of. In the top left hand, we've got an almond orchard. And then at the bottom two, these are two cherry orchards that I work within out at Young in New South Wales. But I guess I'm hoping what you guys are seeing straight away is that within almond orchards in particular, there's a real management practice of removing all co-flowering plants that are on that bottom layer between hedgerows, between the crops themselves and in between the trees themselves. Whilst in cherry orchards, what we see is there is a retainment of the co-flowering species. Sometimes these properties will have remnant eucalypt forests that are adjacent to the crop area. And this can be really important in terms of helping to facilitate native pollinators that are within those areas. Obviously, these are highly disturbed areas in terms of this used to be once forest, and now we're trying to grow crops. So in terms of both managed honeybee health and native pollinator health, we really need to be aware that these are highly modified systems and that potentially we need to be adding additional resources into those areas to help facilitate their existence within them. So in Australia, the vast majority of our crop pollination is carried out by European honeybees. They are the dominant managed pollinator for obvious reason, ease of bringing them into these systems. Their floral constancy is very good, so the way in which they pollinate is very effective. But there are native pollinators that also provide these crucial resources as well in terms of pollination. So crops like mangoes, the vast majority of pollinators on mango crops, especially in the territory, are actually native pollinators. And they're usually in the terms of flies, but also stingless bees. Even on our work out at Young, there was quite a few native bees that are also visiting the crops. Within our systems though, and especially now that we have varroa mite, we have been over-reliant to some extent on honeybees and probably taking them for granted to much degree. Bianca touched on the fact that a lot of our pollination is actually carried out by feral honeybees, which is absolutely correct. So potentially into the future, we're going to see a decline on properties that aren't, using or bringing in managed hives and that were reliant on feral honeybees. So we're going to have to see some sort of change there. Either they're going to have to pay then for pollination services to be brought on in terms of honeybees, or we're going to have to try and foster relationships to support native pollinators within these systems. Yeah, and so Bianca was exactly right. We will see a huge decline in our feral hives. So realistically, we're probably looking, if we look at the rest of the world, in a 90 to 95% decrease in feral hives. So this will be a massive problem in terms of trying to secure pollination for our pollinator-dependent crops. Some of the native pollinators that we do have within these systems are native bees. We also have a range of different beetles for certain crops, and some of them can even be pollinated by flies. And I guess I just want to stress that there is more to our pollination systems than just bees. That obviously depends on the crop itself. But realistically, if we are encouraging other pollinators, if they can do an effective job, we'll build up some sort of resilience, and we'll have move away from that over-reliance on one particular pollinator, which is really crucial as well. So when we're trying to think about our native pollinators, obviously we need to think about, well, what was the ecosystem like before we put in an agricultural landscape? So, we used to have diverse eucalypt-dominant woodlands with understory, lots of structure, lots of floral resources. Those floral resources would be available year-round. But it's not just in terms of floral resources either. We would have had a range of nesting habitat as well. And both these things are really crucial when we're trying to support and encourage native pollinators within these systems. If we have broad-scale clearing, obviously this limits severely the opportunities for outside floral resources, but also those nesting opportunities as well. So when we're thinking about agricultural landscapes, these are often highly simplified compared to the native forest that would have been there. Typically, there's very little in terms of floral resources that flower outside of the crop period. And really, these are crucial for wild insects and bees, and even managed bees. So it's really a boom and bust kind of landscape in terms of the floral resources. You'll have a very dramatic impact mass flowering crop, which might last anywhere from 1 week through to a couple of months. But outside that window, typically what we've seen is removal of any co-flowering species, whether that be when it coincides with the crop or outside or before that period as well. We also need to consider the types of management practices that are occurring on the property itself as well. A lot of our ground nesting bees in particular live in soil. So, things like ploughing, residual chemicals, grazing, this can all disturb insect habitat. So perhaps, you might be seeing flow-on effects then to your pollination services of your crop if you're looking at native bee pollination in those systems. So this kind of brings me to, well, what should our orchards really look like then? And how should we be thinking about supporting, conserving native pollinators? And I guess the one thing that I want to stress here is, indeed, a lot of crops aren't necessarily visited by native pollinators. There are some that are heavily dependent on native pollinators. But if we are supporting conserving natives within these systems, we're actually not just potentially improving crop yield within our agricultural sector, but what we are doing is also helping the native plants that are on the periphery of these ecosystems as well. So we're able to then support and conserve pollinators to link habitat. It might be native habitat that's on the boundary fences or along roadsides, but this will help them to be able to reproduce as well. So there's kind of like a twofold flow-on effect here. Some of the research that we've been conducting, especially in apples and in cherries orchards, has really looked at this idea of co-flowering plants and how they can support pollinators. So you might remember when I showed the almond orchard and the removal of all those co-flowering plants and the understory there. That was a typical management practice that was kind of put forward to growers. But really, when we went to some of these apple and cherry orchards, we were seeing that there are co-flowering plants. So what we wanted to do was understand whether or not they're supporting pollinators and helping facilitate pollination of crops, or if we're potentially getting competition. So here is just a schematic of what could occur. We could have this nice flowering understory between the apple trees. There might be lots of floral diversity here. But we could get a scenario whereby we're actually getting all of our native pollinators visit co-flowering species at the bottom of the tree. And this can impact the number of visits and the pollination of our crop. So this is what we would see as a competition for floral visitors or for pollinators. On the flip side of that, what we could see is facilitation for visits, whereby because we've got co-flowering plant species, we've got a greater diversity of pollinators visiting our crop. We've got more abundance of our pollinators visiting the crop, and this can lead to more frequent visits and a higher yield of that crop. And indeed, this is exactly the kind of scenario we saw a facilitative effect of having co-flowering species within apples and cherry orchards. It was actually beneficial for growers to retain those co-flowering plants within these ecosystems. So to support pollinators, and this is another apple orchard out at Gilpin in New South Wales, having food year-round is super important. So this was taken in winter, but you can see we've got some brassica that's flowering in the foreground here, and that's a great floral resource for pollinators, both managed honeybees, but also feral bees and native bees as well. So we really need to be thinking about how we can provide floral resources year-round, especially during the activity periods of the pollinators. And this will help with bee health. Not all plants obviously created equal, so we really need to think about what types of plants we're planting out, especially if there's potential for them to invade the native ecosystems that are around. And if we're trying to support native pollinators, really we need to be thinking about native genetically provenant plant species that can then be put out in these systems. And we also need to be thinking about the types of resources. So obviously we need pollen and nectar, but we need to be thinking about other things like resin. A lot of resin is used in the construction of hives. So we need to be thinking about plants and resources that the bees can gather for resin. I'll just quickly touch on this because this is some of the research that we did up in Katherine area and in Darwin. And here we were looking at pollination of mangoes and how we can really support and facilitate pollination within those systems. So mango orchards are really large and typically there's not much ground cover underneath, but along the edges of the property, there's usually fantastic bushland. Like I said previously, one of the major pollinators of mangoes are actually flies, and they're usually these carrion breeding flies. At a certain time in their life cycle, they need nectar to feed their young. And so that's the opportunity at which we're seeing them become effective pollinators of mango flowers. So what we did was we actually created what we were calling stink stations. Okay, so, you know, flies, obviously, in this case, they didn't need extra floral resources. What they actually needed to boost their populations was carrion. So we got a whole heap of carcasses and we had these barrels and we were putting them out into these orchards to try and facilitate and breed up those colonies of flies to help pollination within those systems. And it worked very effectively, I can tell you. Carrying out the study and watching the maggots was a bit tricky, but well worth it in the end. So yeah, we just need to be thinking about what types of pollinators we can facilitate and how we'd go about breeding up those populations. Another major pollinator within these systems is actually the syrphids, so hoverflies. And one of the key things that they need for their breeding cycle is water availability. So potentially popping out places where they can breed within these water troughs is going to help boost pollination within those systems. So pollinators obviously need more than just food, and we've touched on a bit of that. A lot of our native bees are actually ground nesting bees, and so they need access to soil. So things like mulching, ploughing, grazing by hooved animals obviously can impact the ground and therefore their availability of habitat for these guys. We also need to think about the other types of bees, so the other 30%, which really require, pithy stems and small holes in wood and hollows and those kind of things. So when we're thinking about large-scale cropping systems, retaining some bushland that has some of these key attributes is really important to try and help support and conserve these types of pollinators. This was an aerial photograph from some of the orchards that I work in Bilpin. And you can see that the Bilpin area, for anyone that's unfamiliar, it's actually surrounded by Blue Mountains National Park and Wallamai National Park. So it's a very unique system, but it has fantastic bushland either side of most of the properties that we actually work on. So in order to, these systems are heavily dependent on honeybees, but they're also visited very frequently by stingless bees, and they actually enact a lot of the pollination that occurs in these apple crops. And I guess this really just proves that maintaining that bushland, especially when it comes to native pollinators, because they actually don't travel very far. They only travel about 400 to 500 meters at best. But having that bushland that's close up towards the crop can really be beneficial, because you can get those flow-on effects from pollinators that are in the bushland coming out and then onto your property. Retaining this habitat is obviously really important, well, potentially just not only for the pollination of the crop, but also in terms of linking habitat for wild pollinators throughout the landscape. So, there's that twofold effect that I was talking about before in terms of benefits for the crops, but also benefits for native bushland pollination as well. One aspect of our research, and this is something that comes up quite frequently, is about habitat augmentation and whether or not bee hotels can be effective in helping boost pollination within farm settings. And so we went out and we tried this. We used pithy stems, so bamboo kind of bee hotels, and also hardwood blocks. And we also had a ground nesting bee habitat augmentation as well. We did find that we did get uptake of bees into these hotels. So yes, they are potential habitat for bees, but at the scale that we need pollination, this really isn't a very effective way of supporting pollinators on a farm. It's far better that you could support them by retaining some of that native bushland and potentially linking those habitats so that you get a flow-on effect of pollinators moving throughout the landscape, rather than providing unnatural resources like this. Okay, so supporting conserving is obviously crucial. We really need to think about how pollination occurs within Australia, especially in terms of supporting pollinators that are within the landscape, in terms of the floral resources that are available. And now it's even more important, especially with varroa sweeping through the nation. We need to create agricultural areas that plan for the needs of the pollinators themselves. We need to be thinking about in terms of foraging distances, food resources, and habitat, and how that's occurring year-round. All right, and that's basically it for me.
Great. Thanks, Amy-Marie. And once again, a really insightful and detailed presentation.